And I prepared some lectures here to remind you of the things we discussed in the second course. Now, if you remember, social medicine is studied as a theoretical basis of public health. And so social medicine focuses mostly on group level, population level health. Thus, the most important parts of it, parts studied are demography, epidemiology, and the organization of healthcare. The idea is that the organization of healthcare in a country should ideally be based on demographic and epidemiologic data, somehow which is supposed to define the objective health needs of the population of the entire country, some regions of it, some cities. And so we'll start with demography, we'll continue with epidemiology, and finally finish with organization of healthcare. So, are there any questions up to now?
No, everything is okay.
Okay, so if not, mute your microphones. Not all of you have done so. Only turn on your microphones when you have to say something. You have to comment something or use the chat. But you can always interrupt me for questions. Okay, so demography today. Let's take a look at two presentations I've prepared. By the way, after we're finished with the presentations, I will upload them to the classroom. And the practical assignment that we'll have is an epidemiology task, but let's pass through epidemiology tomorrow and then I'll upload it. So, demographic approaches to the assessment of public health. The health and healthcare needs of a population cannot be measured or met without knowledge of its size and characteristics. Demography is the systematic and scientific study of human populations. The word demography apparently comes from two Greek words. So it means something like writings about populations, description of populations, something like this. Demography is the science that studies the size, composition, and distribution of the human population of a given area at a specific point in time. And this direction of studies in demography is called demographic statics sometimes. So it's sort of a snapshot of the population at a point in time. And also demography studies the changes in population size and composition. Why does the population change year after year and not remain the same, constant as it initially was? And that's demographic dynamics. So dynamics means population movements here. The first presentation is on the demographic static, and the second presentation is on the demographic dynamics. Now, medical demography is a subdiscipline within the field of demography that involves the application of the methods of demography to study health and healthcare. It shares an interest in population level health with social medicine. The demographic features of a population serve as both determinants and consequences of the relationship between the population and the health system. For example, if the population exhibits high health status, it can be expected to have low mortality rates and a relatively old age structure, since attrition through death will be minimal. At the same time, The demographic characteristics of the population will have an effect on its health status and health service needs. For example, the age composition of the population will be reflected in the types of health problems that are common. Demographic data. One example that I probably provided in the second course is that, of course, if you compare a country like Bulgaria and a country like Afghanistan, the completely different demographic structure of the population will, of course, predict the appearance of completely different health problems and very different needs of healthcare organization in the two countries, because a country like Afghanistan will have a pretty large population for its territory, growing population, very young population, with predominance of males. But a country like Bulgaria, so typical European country, will have a pretty small population for its territory, shrinking, aged, and with predominance of females. Now, such types of countries will have very different needs of healthcare afterwards. Of course, the country with the younger population will exhibit a high share of acute diseases and conditions in the prevailing pathology. So infectious parasitic diseases, complications of birth and pregnancy, nutritional deficits, hypovitaminosis, while the country and this country with the more acute pathology will need many hospitals for active treatment. While the country with the aged population will exhibit mostly a prevalence of NCDs, non-communicable diseases, so chronic, mostly non-infectious diseases, and will require more general practitioners, for example, medical centers, home care units, homes for the elderly, hospices, etc., etc. Now, demographic data. Most demographic data are routinely collected. The basic sources of demographic data are the census and registers. The census is a snapshot of a population at one point in time, usually performed once every 10 years. The United Nations recommends that censuses be conducted at least decennially in years ending in 0 or 1. So it's a sort of a mechanical counting of the whole population attempted in this particular year. And then you have the registers, which operate on a continuous basis. So they are always there, always active. In terms of the vital registry system, it means that no vital events, and vital events, these are births and deaths in demography, so no birth and death happening inside the country is let to slip unnoticed. It is immediately registered by someone. So there are such systems in place for continuous registering of the population, and the data from the vital registry and the census complement each other. Most developed countries have well-established registration systems with complete or near complete coverage, plus, of course, they perform a census every 10 years. Now, in underdeveloped countries and in many developing countries, in fact, most of them, both systems have the holes, or the population is not counted at all. So we cannot be absolutely certain, for example, about the population of China or India, and we don't know at all the population of Africa, for example. No one knows how many people live in the different African countries. It is just some sort of forecast, some hypothesis, nothing more. Most probably, there are, in fact, more people living there than we officially know. It is also a phenomenon that was observed in India after the last census. The population turned out to be way larger than it was officially known. And as you've probably heard, India is already the most populous country on our planet. It's the largest nation. It surpassed China. Population estimates. In the inter-census period, population estimates are updated annually using a standard technique known as the cohort component method. In simple terms, the previous year's population estimate is aged on by 1 year with births added and deaths removed. Of course, the final count of the population has to take into account also the migration into the country and from the country. Because when we study demographic static, we study two things. We study the size and the structure of the population. What's the population count on one hand, and on the other hand, what are the groups differentiated inside the population? The most important subdivision is of the population is according to age and gender, age and sex. Of course, you can subdivide the population into other groups according to your needs and desires, like according to income, ethnicity, religion, etc., etc. But the most important subdivision is according to age and gender, and it has very direct medical consequences. But that's demographic static, and according to the demographic dynamics, there are two types of population movement possible, and they explain why the population changes. Doesn't matter if the country is Bulgaria, Greece, whatever, but the population changes each year. And that's because of the natural movement of the population, which is births minus deaths. And then we have the mechanical movement of the population, which is immigration minus emigration. So combine all these, then you get, of course, the final estimate of the population. Now, the population estimates refer to the number of people in the population on the 30th of June each year. Statistics are therefore often referred to as the mid-year population. So, demographic static again refers to population size, distribution, and structure. The population size. Size is typically measured in terms of the number of individuals who reside in on the territory of this particular country at a specified time. The most complete count of a population is performed by means of a census. If we rely only on the registration systems, some sort of error will always appear when counting the population, and the error grows larger year after year. That's why we have the census every 10 years to correct for the already accumulated error. After the population size, we have to discuss the population distribution. It's the manner in which the population is distributed within a geographic area. And this is mostly studied by the so-called internal migration, internal migratory movements. Because immigration and emigration, this is external or international migration. But inside the country, we also have migratory movements. We have the urbanization process, also commuting and seasonal movements of the population. Now, each distribution and the population pyramid. If we focus on the most important considerations about the structure of the population, of course, we have to focus on the age and sex structure of the population. For many purposes, the age distribution of a population represents the most significant compositional variable. The results of demographic processes from the past are reflected in the age structure of the population. And it's a basis, of course, for future demographic developments. Here we can use the population pyramid, which is a graphic representation, depiction of the population. It's a very elegant tool because just looking at the shape of the so-called population pyramid, which in fact looks more like a triangle, it's a two-dimensional figure, we can immediately diagnose the population of this particular country. We can immediately tell in what stage of the demographic development this particular nation is and what's the prognosis for the future for the population of this country. We don't need precise numbers. The shape of the pyramid tells us everything we need to know. So the population pyramid is, in fact, two ordinary histograms representing the male and female populations in usually 1 or 5 year age categories, placed on their sides and back to back. The base of the pyramid, representing the size of each age-sex population groups, is presented in either absolute numbers or percentages. In general, we have three possible shapes for the pyramid. But let's look at the pyramid. We have the horizontal axis here. And here we put population numbers. Here we put males on the left, and on the right we put females. We can also use not absolute numbers here, but we can also use percentages, percentage shares of the population. And it will, in fact, produce a somehow more neat figure overall. Then on the vertical axis, we put subgroups, age groups of the population. Here, the step is 5 years, so it's 0 to 5, 5 to 10 years, etc., etc., and then it ends with centennial people, aged 100 and more. So we have this, and we have this. And then it's entirely possible that the so-called pyramid is skewed towards the left or the right, depending on which sex is present more in this country. For example, in Bulgaria, approximately 55% of the population is females, so the figure would be somewhat skewed towards the right. If we find some gaps, bulges, we have to discuss, of course, what they mean. If we don't have any sort of even shape for the pyramid. Considering that these here at the basis are newborn babies, if we see large bases here, it means that many babies are being born in the country. If the population then disappears all of a sudden, ending in some sharp angle, it means that we have high fertility and high mortality in the country. And this is typical of underdeveloped countries. If we have a predominance of the population in Middle Ages, then we have a developed country with pretty low fertility. So not so many babies are being born here, but then the population lives up until old age. And if we have such gaps, bulges, holes, etc., we have to find out why. We have to trace back the year those people were supposed to be born, and then we'll find that some population is missing, for example, because of wars. So fertility was lower in wartime in these countries. Then we have some baby booms after these wars are over. So these things lead to such uneven shape of the population pyramid. This here is the population pyramid for the United Kingdom in 2010. Types of pyramids. The expansive type. So let me try to, sorry. Let's have a pause for 1 minute and I'll try to let the dog out because it's sleeping next to me and snoring, which you probably hear. Yes, okay. The interference is over. So first, the expansive shape. The expansive shape looks like this, or like this. It looks like a triangle. When the French introduced the population pyramid in the 18th century, all European countries looked like this. It means high fertility, and then the population disappears. So high fertility coupled with high mortality. That's typical of underdeveloped countries to this day. So you will find this shape of the pyramid in Africa, the triangle shape. So the expansive shape with a wide population base is typical for fast-growing populations where each birth cohort is larger than the previous one. A country or region has a high birth rate and a large percentage of its population under the age of 15. By the way, underdeveloped countries are sometimes called teenage nations because the median age of the population in such countries is somewhere between 14 and 18. Next, we have the constrictive shape, which is typical of developed countries. You have a narrow base, so too few babies are being born, and you have lower percentages of younger populations. So this thing here was typical of Africa and somewhat of Latin America and Southeast Asia, and the constrictive shape is typical of modern, highly developed countries like Germany and Japan. The growing elderly population will have a smaller workforce to provide the economic base for the dependent age population. We call the dependent population this population that does not work. So it means either youngsters or pensioners, retired people. And finally, we have the stationary shape, which is the best a highly developed country can hope for. So this one is stationary, this one is constrictive, and these two here are expansive. See the narrow base here for the constrictive pyramid. It's called still a pyramid, though it doesn't look like a pyramid any longer. So the best a highly developed country can hope for is the stationary shape, which presents somewhat similar percentages for all age groups. The population pyramids of Scandinavian countries, for example, fall in this group. It means stable population, more or less. It will not increase, but it will not decrease either. Of course, the population of Scandinavian countries increases, but that's because of migration. If it wasn't for migration, the population, of course, of countries such as Sweden and Norway would remain the same, and the population of countries like Germany would constantly decrease. Although fertility has the greatest potential impact on age structure and population growth, in some circumstances, mortality may become a more important influence. So, in modern developed countries, in fact, mortality is already more important. Many factors may affect the population pyramid, such as the loss of a large number of people during wartime, like it currently happens, of course, with Russia and Ukraine. They've lost many young people as a consequence of their war, which would, of course, which will catastrophically hit these countries because these nations were shrinking anyway and they're very aged. So, yes, they were dying before the war, but they were dying slowly. And now, as a consequence of this war, these nations will die quickly. That's the difference. Okay. You'll take a look at the figures again later when you browse through the slides from the presentations. And you can see here how the different shapes of pyramids correspond to different stages of the demographic transition. And the demographic transition is a concept we're going to discuss in the second presentation. Basically, this is the life cycle of a nation. That's what it is. So you have here with the blue line, the birth rate of a population, like an entire nation, per thousands. So if we start here with, let's say, 27 per thousand, it means that for every 1,000 citizens in the country, 27 babies are being born. So this was what this country had initially. And then at one point in time, fertility started decreasing. So the number of babies being born dropped to a little more than 5 per thousand each year. As for the death rate, it was initially almost the same as the birth rate, so mortality counterbalanced fertility, but then all of a sudden mortality decreased a lot, so the population started increasing. Now this is the population numbers. Here it's more or less constant, and then the population increases rapidly. And then what happens next is, at one point in time, birth rates and death rates become the same, and at one point in time, deaths begin to prevail over births. And then the population starts decreasing. So this is what's basically happening with all countries globally. In fact, nations behave much like individuals. So nations such as the Bulgarian nation, Greek nation, etc., have their infancy, young age, old age, and finally, possibly, death, extinction. Uh, Most probably, nations that do not compensate for their shrinking numbers with the constant importation of migrants and refugees will in fact disappear. Uh, Now it's too early to say, of course, because it hasn't happened before in history. We don't know for certain that entire nations can disappear, but there is a small group of optimists to this day among scientists who believe that nations will not become extinct, that they will stabilize at lower population numbers. But then there is a majority of scientists nowadays who believe that nations will start disappearing one after another. Of course, such nations attracting many migrants, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Sweden, etc., they will never disappear. But nations attracting a small number of migrants or no migrants at all are threatened by extinction and most probably will disappear in the future. So countries like Bulgaria, Japan, Russia are supposed to disappear altogether from the map of the world. It seems just like a matter of time. And you can see how the pyramids change in the different stages of population development. When this happens in all countries, initially you have some sort of primitive agricultural economy. You have many kids being born in each family. So think of some poor African country like Mali, Niger, Somalia, Lesotho, etc., etc. In such countries, you have something like 5, 6, or even 10 children per family that are used as a cheap workforce. Many of them will be dying early. So maternal mortality and infant mortality are very high in underdeveloped countries, but still births will prevail a little over mortality, so the population will still increase. And then in the next stage, you have fertility remaining still high, but mortality drops drastically. And this is the stage of development where you can observe a real population explosion inside the country. The population doubles, triples, quadruples, etc., etc. Most Islamic countries nowadays are either in this stage or this stage, while many African countries are still in this stage. So why does this happen? Fertility remains high in most Islamic countries because they still retain the traditional family model. So most women will stay at home and raise kids. They will not be part of the workforce. You won't have two working parents in the family. On the other hand, mortality has dropped drastically because there is already some socio-economic development in the country. There is some middle class formed. There is some healthcare available. So this is the best stage to be in, and the population increases rapidly. And then when you reach the stage of being a true developed country, population growth stops all of a sudden. It stops, of course, because women start working. And when women start working, of course, fertility experiences a big fatal hit it can never recover from again. No matter how you try to stimulate fertility afterwards in your country, you won't succeed. No country has ever succeeded in this. you can't stimulate fertility once it's dropped down. And then eventually you reach the stage where fertility remains low, but mortality increases again. Why? Because the population lives very long. So lots of old people accumulate among the population. Since life expectancy is very high, you now have many aged individuals, and of course their individual probability of dying all of a sudden during the year is very high. The probability of you dying all of a sudden during the year, if you're currently 20 or 30 years of age, is very low. But the probability of you dying all of a sudden during the year when you're 70 or 80 is very high. So once elderly people start to prevail among the population, mortality increases again. For example, Bulgaria and Germany had their lowest mortality in approximately the year 1970. And ever since then, mortality in these countries is increasing. And Greece is pretty similar. Okay, so these are the stages of the demographic transition in general. And it's called the demographic transition because in the end, it's a transition from a young and increasing in numbers society to an old and shrinking society. And here you have more boys and men, and here you have more girls and women in the final stage of development. Population aging. The median age is the age that divides the population into two equal groups. So basically, it's some sort of hypothetical citizen. Half the population is younger than him and half the population is older. Now, for example, in the year 2014, the median age ranged from 15 years in Uganda and the Gaza Strip to 40 or more in several European countries and Japan. Now, in fact, the median age currently for the population in Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, Macedonia, Germany, the European Union as a whole is something like 45, 46 years already. And then we have countries that are already with the median age of over 50. The oldest nation in the world is Monaco, followed by Japan. Population aging refers to changes in the age composition of a population such that there is an increase in the proportion of older persons. The indicators for population aging are the aging index and the total dependency ratio. So basically, you might compare the populations over 60 or over 65 to the population below 50 or 80. Basically, the idea is to compare the size of the population of the elderly with the size of the population for the future replacements, those that are coming of age. This is how global population advances. This is the year 1950. The world population is 2.6 billion, and the median age of the global population is 23.6 years. Then we have 2018, so almost 8 billion people living on Earth with 30 years median age. And then you can see how things are going to progress in the future. 2050, 2075, and the end of the 21st century in which we currently live. The global population will increase, and the median age of the population will increase. By the way, what's the borderline here? When do you consider officially a country being aged? So in severe trouble. The borderline is 35. So any country that has a median age of the population of over 35 is already aged. And it will, of course, suffer all the consequences. Health consequences, direct economical consequences, etc., etc. Basically, it is a sign that the nation is dying. Now, Turkey, for example, has a median age of the population of below 35. It's around 30 for Turkey, but that's because Turkey was a developing country not so long ago, so it still retains some demographic features of a developing country, even though it's a developed country already. The gender balance. So, of course, the population of Turkey is going to continue to increase throughout this century. And since the population of Russia decreases at the same time, during this century, at one point in time, we'll see Turkey and Russia with exactly the same population, because the Turkish population increases year after year and the Russian population decreases year after year. So during this century, they will meet in the middle and have the same population, which of course will make Turkey a very strong country and Russia a very weak country, because you can't compare a country with a lots of young population with a country formed by mostly pensioners, deadbeat old horses. They are incomparable. Okay, in economic, military, or whatever potential. The gender balance now. Do we have more males or females in the population? Now, to remind you quickly of this, initially more boys are being born. Why is that? No one knows, but it's probably a natural compensatory mechanism. So initially we'll have more males in the population, but afterwards, because of the higher mortality of the male gender, numbers will become equal, and at one point in time, women will get to prevail in the population, in the general population. So theoretically, all countries nowadays should have a prevalence of females, but it's not true, in fact. There are many countries across the globe where you have more males than females. But if you see such a situation, you have to investigate why. Because it's not natural. It's not supposed to happen. Now, in practically all European countries, you'll find more females than males, just as expected, because the average life expectancy is very different for the two genders. It is much higher for females. But then, if you see more males, it means that, for example, this society is very conservative, traditional, backward. So women are discriminated. They receive substandard medical services, or boys are preferred to girls. So many girls are aborted. Or, for example, there is high maternal mortality in the country. So many girls are dying when giving early births. But whatever the reason is, it has to be investigated, because it's certainly not a normal situation to have more males than females in the country. And in some cases, it happens because the country imports many migrants, and most of them are males. For example, this will be the situation observed in countries such as Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. They will import many working worker migrants, but they will be males. So the end result, of course, is having way more males in the population than females. If it's China or India, you have more males in the population simply because families prefer boys. So many girls will be aborted. If it's the African countries, you will have more males because many women die at birth as a consequence of complications of pregnancy or birth. Okay. Migration. In many countries, migration is the predominant influence on the final structure and distribution of the population. Of course, you have internal and international migration. I already mentioned this. Implications of migration for the population. Well, of course, it changes drastically the ethnic composition of the population, but we have no choice. Now, if you're a developed country and you're missing young working population, you have only two options left. You can import migrants and refugees all the time, and these will be young people or already formed young families. So this will solve your demographic problems. But then, of course, you have to make sure that your country is able to integrate all these migrants or refugees. Because if you're some country like the United States, Canada, Australia, they have, of course, long traditions of being able to successfully integrate migrants, and they have no problems arising from this. But if you are like most European countries, then these imported migrants and refugees, because of the failure of the state to integrate them, will lead to constant frictions between the new populations and the old populations of the country, and possibly one day even some sort of civil war. A revolution may start in the country. And the other option, of course, is to not do anything because you're hostile to migrants and refugees. And then, of course, you'll die in proud and lonely solitude. This is what's happening to most Eastern European countries. They are by temperament, so to speak, fascist countries. So they don't like any sort of foreigners. Of course, Bulgaria is like this, Hungary is like this, etc., etc. Russians are like this. So Japan is like this also. So it's not just European countries that are fascist societies like this, very hostile to all kinds of foreigners. So these nations would simply die slowly but surely, because in each subsequent generation you have less young people, especially young women. So this means less potential mothers. So you're in fact spiraling downwards to ever decreasing fertility until finally your nation expires. The most, of course, threatened nations by imminent extinction are the Baltic countries currently. In Europe, they're very close to extinction. It seems that also countries like Macedonia and Moldova are as well doomed. There is no hope in sight. And then one day, larger nations would also start to disappear. So countries like Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, etc., etc. But it's a matter of time. Of course, it would take a lot of time for a large country like Russia to disappear. And maybe it won't disappear. Maybe it will be replaced by a new Muslim country because they don't have, of course, the same problems with fertility in the Islamic regions of Russia. And the Islamic population of Russia grows at very high rates. Very high rates. They are the European country with the highest share of the Muslim population. Okay. Implications of migration for health and healthcare. Now, in fact, migration reflects on what we do in healthcare. Because, first of all, considering that these migrants and refugees coming to your country are younger and coming from poorer countries, of course, they bring their health problems with them. So now you need, again, more obstetricians, pediatricians, etc., to take care of their needs. Now you see the resurgence of some tropical diseases that have long been forgotten in your country. For example, you see new cases of malaria or tuberculosis, which you have forgotten about already in your country, etc. So, of course, these waves of migrants change the outlook for healthcare in the country, and it has to transform somehow to meet their needs of the new populations. Now, migrant and refugee populations become more and more similar to the mainstream population, the host population in the country, but this happens after the first generation, in the second and third generation already. Okay, then here you have some explanations which you can read at home. Nothing that is not self-explanatory. You can see, of course, that this incoming population may have different cultural values, beliefs, etc., and yes, most probably they will. So they would require different type of healthcare services now. Okay. I mentioned this briefly. We don't have to delve on this. Let's go now to the demographic dynamics. And this will be it for today. So, any questions so far?
Yes, Professor. Can I ask you something?
Yes, sure.
It's actually about the United States. How has the United States population changed over the years?
It's doing fine. They can't rely already on their own fertility like it was in the past, even though they traditionally have more kids per family than in Europe, but it's not sufficient already. So the rate of natural increase of the population is already insufficient. So nowadays, in fact, they exclusively rely on migrants. So officially and unofficially, they will be in the future more like Canada. So relying entirely on the constant influx of young migrants to support the country.
Okay, Professor, thank you.
And I would like to ask about the mean middle age of Europe. Is that more than 35 and Like,
Yes,
what is about?
it is 45 point something for the European Union, and Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, Germany have exactly this average value. That's average for the EU. So the population of the European Union is very old, alarmingly old. Objectively speaking, we need to constantly import many young migrants and refugees. Otherwise, we'll become unimportant because the economy of the EU and our military capabilities will shrink. So we need younger populations, and we have to make sure, of course, we can integrate them. If not, it's our fault. But we cannot rely on our own fertility. That's out of the question.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. So we know, of course, very well that most people in Europe do not like migrants and refugees, but we politicians have to explain the population very clear, loud and clear, that we have no other option or we will fail into obscurity. We simply have no options left. But I would expect that we will start to look more and more like Cuba and Brazil in the future. Because I know we experienced some influx of migrants from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, but frankly speaking, that's nothing. That's just a drop of water, something like this. The real immigrant wave to Europe will come from Africa because there's a real explosion of the population, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and these countries are completely incapable to take care of their own population. They're unable to educate them, they're unable to feed them. So all of these people will come to Europe to save themselves. So in fact, we'll be hit by a huge wave of migrants, and we have to be prepared. And right now, I think we're wasting time instead of preparing to meet them. If we are able to integrate them, like it happened in countries like Brazil, then our problems will be solved. Of course, we won't be, in the end, as white as we currently are. But these are, after all, normal things. This is what happened historically. After all, humankind originated in Africa. And humans were initially black in color anyway. The white skin is a feature that appeared later in Europe. Initially, African populations populated Europe, and they became white afterwards, after many generations. So we're simply repeating this initial process of populating Europe right now. But right now, we don't notice this because these African migrants that are coming to Europe are coming to Europe through Spain and Italy, which is far away from us, so we don't notice them. But it will become noticeable. And all of these Arabs, they are nothing compared to the sea of African people that is coming to us. Okay, so let's focus now on the demographic dynamics. And in approximately 1 hour, we'll be finished for today. We'll attempt each day to finish at around 11 o'clock so that you don't get very tired and bored. Demographic dynamics now. It should be clear that the size of a population can change only through the processes of fertility, mortality, and migration. There are only two ways of entering a population, either being born into it or moving into it. And there are also only two ways of leaving a population, either dying or moving out of it. Now, it is then stated that an area's population size can change because of only three types of events: births, deaths, and migration. These three events are known as the components of the demographic change, and also as the three demographic processes. Natural changes in the population. Now, I've already mentioned this. You have the natural increase of the population. It's always present. It's inevitable because all populations will have some births and deaths, of course. That's unavoidable. But then, to the final count, you also have to add the net migration, immigration minus emigration. So you combine, in the end, the rate of natural increase of the population with the rate of mechanical increase of the population, and then as a result, you get the final rate of increase of the population. Now, pay attention that it's called a rate of increase, but in many cases, in fact, it will be rate of decrease of the population. Fertility. Now, let's take a look at these two very important processes because we already mentioned migration, but let's now take a look at the two natural processes, the fertility and the mortality. As for the migration, pay attention that it's a bit tricky because the fact is most countries do not precisely know their rate of mechanical increase. In order to know exactly how many people are leaving the country each year and how many migrants, refugees, etc., are coming to your country, you need to have some sort of perfect police state. And very rarely you'll be able to find such countries. For example, North Korea is like this, Belarus is like this, Japan is like this. So they know precisely how many migrants they have. But countries like Bulgaria, Greece, Germany, Russia, the United States, no, not at all. No one knows what precisely are the migratory flows, how many migrants come and how many people leave. And that's why we're always surprised when we see the results from the national census. They always surprise us because the national census is not like the vital registry system. The vital registry system, of course, catches only the changes in the population caused by births and deaths, so the natural increase of the population. But the census is there precisely for this purpose. It also catches the changes in the population as a result of migration. That's why we need the census. And all of a sudden, it turns out that we have way more or way less people in the country than initially predicted. And that's the result, the final result of migration. So yes, once every 10 years, we know how many people, in fact, came legally or illegally to Greece, Germany, etc., etc. If it wasn't for the census, we wouldn't know. Okay, so fertility now. It's the actual production of newborn babies, refers to real behavior. It's the bearing of living children. It's a complex issue influenced by cultural, social, economic, religious, political factors. Now, pay attention that there are less precise and more precise indicators here. Let me remind you about this. At first, as a starting point, we have the number of newborn babies per year. Does this really tell us something? No, not really. Not really. It cannot be used as an indicator to base our health policy in the country on. We cannot use it to compare ourselves with other countries. So at the very least, we have to divide the number of births happening annually over the size of the population of our country. And then we multiply it by something in order to get some figure, some number easy to work with. So nowadays it is widely accepted to multiply by 1,000. So population changes in demography nowadays are calculated per 1,000. In the past, they were calculated in percentages, in fact, so per 100, but since births and deaths became somewhat rare events nowadays, they are already calculated per 1,000. So the crude birth rate is this: the number of births during the year divided by the whole population of the country and multiplied by 1,000. So, for example, in 2007, the crude birth rate for the entire world was 21 per 1,000. It means that 21 babies were born for each 1,000 people in the global population. Now, in general, if you have a crude birth rate of more than 30, it should be considered high. This is typical, of course, of underdeveloped countries. This is what happens there. But if you have less than 15, it's low. And most probably, as a result, your population will shrink. While, of course, in such countries, it will always increase. Now, why is it called the crude birth rate? And it's the same with the death rate of the population. It's called crude death rate. It's the number of people that have died during the year divided by the population multiplied by 1,000. It is considered crude, meaning that it is not in itself used for international comparisons. And it is not used as a basis for the health, demographic policy, etc. of the country. Instead, it is converted in more precise indicators. By itself, it is only used for a short-term forecast for the population. So to calculate the rate of natural increase of the population. And the rate of natural increase is the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. So how many people are added or lost for each 1,000 citizens. And this is only a short-term forecast for the population. It tells you what will happen with the population in Bulgaria, Greece, etc. in the next 5 or 10 years, but no more than this. If you would like to know what will happen in the future afterwards, or really compare between countries and know which country has higher fertility, Bulgaria or Greece or Germany or some other country, you have to use more precise indicators. These are not suitable. Why are they not suitable and considered crude? Because in the denominator you put the whole population. So, why is this important? The whole population cannot deliver babies. Now, you cannot expect of men or old women or small girls to produce babies. You need young women to produce babies. So, if you put not the whole population in the denominator, but just the women at fertile age, which is approximately somewhere between 15 and 49, then you already have something called general fertility, and this is already considered a precise indicator. You can now compare. Because if the crude birth rate in your country is very low, it is not yet a cause of panic. Maybe it's too low because your population is already very aged. So you simply do not have enough young women in the population that can be potential mothers. But once you put just the number of women here that can actually hypothetically produce babies, and if you still get a low value, now it's time to panic. It means that you have enough potential mothers in the country, but for whatever reason, they do not want to give birth. So yes, now your nation is doomed. Unless, of course, you find many migrants willing to come to your country immediately. This can save you. or cause a revolution and civil war. But okay, we don't care about this. We should leave this to politicians. It's their job to make certain this does not happen. It's not our job as health professionals to care about this. To us, of course, all people are equal. Medicine considers all people equal. As for the crude death rate, it's again the same. If the death rate in your country is very high, it does not necessarily mean that the situation is desperate, your nation is doomed. Maybe it's high because currently your population is very aged. You have too many old people in the general population. But when you standardize, and I'll show you what standardized mortality is, and your mortality is still high, then yes, now it means your country is a failure. You truly have very high mortality in your country, which means healthcare is poor, lifestyles of the population are poor, probably because their education sucks or whatever. You'll have to find the reason. So you have to be careful with crude indicators and know that they are always replaced by more precise and accurate indicators. And in a minute, we'll see how they are replaced with more accurate indicators. But let's take a look at the global map in terms of crude birth rates. Countries that are reddish already in color, as you can see, have extremely high birth rates. So the population, of course, of these countries will increase rapidly. So what do you see here? You see African countries and Afghanistan. And then you see countries that are more and more bullish, meaning that they have, the more dark blue it is, the lower the birth rates are. You can see the lowest birth rates apparently in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Italy, Germany. So these countries are apparently find themselves in dire situation. They have too few babies each year. And we're not much better off, apparently. The United States is a bit better off, but you can see, still not enough. Still not enough. France traditionally has a higher fertility than other European countries. Albania, the UK and the Republic of Ireland, Scandinavian countries, yes, they traditionally have more babies. Still, the number is not sufficient. These countries also have to rely on migrants. You can see Australia here. So apparently, it becomes apparent when you look at the world map that the more developed a country is, the lower the fertility rates are. You can't argue about this. Tunisia is the most developed country in Africa, and of course, just as expected, they have the lowest fertility. Okay, next. The general fertility rate is, of course, superior to the crude birth rate because we've replaced in the denominator the whole population only with this part of the population that can deliver babies. Now, pay attention that this is, again, I should repeat what I've told you in the second course. This is not some number set in stone. This is the typical age of delivery for a certain continent. It doesn't mean that there are some strict biologic considerations here and that you can't see births below 15 and after 49. Of course you can. But this is the typical age of delivery for this particular continent. So in general, for the more developed continents, currently it's 15 to 49. But for Africa and other underdeveloped regions, it is 15 to 44. So this is the number you have to remember for our countries, for European countries. For African countries, 15 to 44. That's the fertile age or childbearing age. And that's why it's called the general fertility rate. Next, you have the total fertility rate, and this is already a very precise indicator, and it is used for international comparisons. Now, this is really important. The way to calculate this is very complicated, so I'm not giving it to you. You simply must know what the total fertility rate means. It is the average number of kids a woman in childbearing or fertile age has. Or to put it simply, it's the average number of kids in the family, or to put it simply, it's the size of the family in your country. Because if you see a total fertility rate of 2, it means that the average family in your country has 2 kids. If you see 3, then they have 3 kids, etc., etc. So it's quite easy to understand. Now, what do we need here? Of course, we need something like around 2.1. This is the replacement level, because 2 parents have to reproduce into 2 kids. And since there is some mortality, some infant mortality, some maternal mortality, so some losses along the way, it has to be a little higher than this number. And then, as usual, you will see huge differences across the globe. You see very low fertility in many highly developed countries that is completely inadequate for replenishment of the population. And then you see extremely high fertility in underdeveloped countries, the poorest of them. That's the map of the world. 0 to 1 children. You don't have countries in this zone yet, luckily. And then you have 1 to 2 children, which is very insufficient. This light blue color. See, here. Many countries are in this zone, which is alarming. It means the population of these countries will decrease in the long run. Even if they still have a positive rate of natural increase and the crude birth rate prevails over the crude death rate, it is true for of some of these countries, it means it's only temporary. It will end in the next 5 to 10 years, and then their population will start shrinking. So all of these countries in the white blue zone are endangered, all of them. You can see some countries that are better off, like France, apparently, like Turkey, but these are exceptions. These are exceptions among the developed countries. And then you see some countries with exorbitant fertility. See, the average number of kids per family is 6 or 7 children. Like here in sub-Saharan Africa. These should be Mali and Niger. If this is Chad, yes, I think so. And then you have some countries, including Afghanistan, which are not much different. And here you see Iraq. So, of course, it's no wonder that many migrants are coming to Europe from these countries. Considering that the median age of the population in Afghanistan is below 18, all of these spare boys have nowhere to go. They're sent by their families to make some money in Europe. And yes, we don't really want them, as you know. Now, can you make the total fertility rate that we saw here even more precise? Yes, in fact, we can. And the answer to the question is, what are these kids that are actually valuable from the point of view of demography and should be left into the final equation, the answer is girls. Now, I'm sorry to report on this, but the reality is what it is. From the point of view of demography, boys are just a byproduct. They are not important in any way. The survival of any nation is guaranteed by its girls and women. So, in fact, the total fertility rate is in the end converted to reproduction rates. And reproduction means simply the reproduction of the female population. So it's in fact a mother reproducing into a daughter or daughters. So any country where a mother reproduces into at least one daughter should not be considered threatened in any way. The future of such country is guaranteed. So we need, in fact, not a total fertility rate of 2, as we initially saw. We need a reproduction rate of at least 1. And this is the final replacement level of fertility, or rather reproduction, that we need. The only difference between the net reproduction rate and the gross reproduction rate is that the net reproduction rate also takes into account some mortality. So it's even more accurate. Why is it, by the way, calculated separately? Why not assume that the reproduction rate is simply half of the fertility rate? Well, because it's not necessarily so. Because you have such countries as China, India, and many more where they consider boys more valuable. So, in fact, they have more boys in the population. So, girls are not, in fact, half of the child population. So, the reproduction rate will work worse than the fertility rate. It's not a problem for India, because they have more than enough kids, but it's a huge problem for China, because China was until recently the most populous country and it looked unstoppable, but then it hit a huge demographic crisis, and from now on, of course, China will quickly lose its strength. It is now at its peak. It will quickly lose its economic and military strength in the future, at the expense, of course, of the United States, who would grow stronger and stronger in the future. And India, of course, the other colossal force that will, of course, dominate the world in the future. And that's because China has its own demographic problems, and they were exacerbated by the one-child policy that they had in the past. And since Chinese families prefer boys, as a result of this one-child policy, they were left with too many boys and too few girls. So right now, the situation is absolutely dire. The total fertility rate for the European Union is 1.6. That's the average for the EU. And Bulgaria, for example, is there. It has the average for the EU. But China has 1.4. But that's the total fertility rate. If you look at the reproduction rates, they are lower than predicted because they have too many boys. So China will experience a huge demographic catastrophe right now. In fact, repeating the demographic catastrophe that the Soviet Union experienced in the past. Basically, they're following in the steps of the Soviet Union, just with a little delay. Started out strong and will finish out most probably miserably. Okay, so that's about the reproduction rate. Now, factors for fertility decline in the developed countries, and they are considered unavoidable nowadays. You can't do anything about them. Let's quickly take a look at them. Increased education, especially of women, decreasing infant and child mortality, which reduces pressure for more children being born in the family. Economic development, improved standards of living, expectations and income levels, urbanization, birth control, and ready, of course, accessibility to contraceptive means. Government policy promoting fertility control as a health measure. Mass media increases awareness of birth control and aspirations to higher standards of living. Health system development and improved access to medical care, changing economic status, social role, and self-image of women, changing social, religious, and political and ideological values. And you can't escape these developments. Trends in fertility. Most of the increase is in countries that have experienced extremely low fertility in the recent past, that is below 1.3 children per woman. At the same time, women are delaying motherhood, giving birth much later in their lives. Yes, nowadays, in many European countries, if not most already, especially inside the EU, the median age of mothers at birth is 35 and more. So mothers in Europe are growing alarmingly old nowadays, and it has health consequences for the mother and the child. Bulgaria, in this respect, is still in somewhat more favorable position because the median age of mothers for Bulgaria is still below 30. The total fertility rate declined steeply between 1980 and the year 2000 in many EU countries, falling far below replacement level. In the year 2000, the total fertility rate was 1.3 in Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Greece, Spain, Italy, Slovenia, and Slovakia. Since then, it has bounced somewhat back, except for Italy and Spain. Their fertility remains extremely low. And the countries with the lowest fertility globally are Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. After reaching a minimum between the years 2000 and 2003, in the 6 years to 2009, the TFR had risen in most EU member states, and in 2009, all EU countries were displaying already rates above 1.3. If current low levels of fertility persist, remember that we need 2.1 still. The populations of more developed countries will decline in size unless the negative natural increase is offset by immigration. Yes, the population of Germany was supposed to start shrinking in 1970 something, but it did not happen. In fact, the population of Germany is increasing because of migration. Of course, nowadays it turns out that a large part of the German population is in fact not German by origin, but this is your only salvation. Otherwise, the nation would constantly shrink and at an increasing pace in each subsequent generation. Mortality. Let's take a look at the other side of the coin, of the equation, mortality. Death is defined as the apparently complete cessation of life after live birth has taken place. Mortality refers to the level of death within a population. Registering deaths is compulsory in all European countries because statistics of deaths are the most widely available and comparable sources of information on health. Basically, countries are compared according to the prevailing causes of death. The data collected through the process of registration is used by statistical and health authorities to monitor diseases and health status, to plan for health services as well. On the reporting of mortality, of course, the more accurately causes of death are diagnosed in the death notes and subsequent death certificates in the country, of course, the better health statistics would be in your own country. Mortality rates. The crude death rate is the twin of the crude death rate, the most commonly used indicator. It needs to be standardized to remove the effect of differences in age structure. So that's an important precaution here, because the crude death rate in a country may be high because the country is very poor, there is no healthcare in the country. It may be high because, not because the country is very poor and with no healthcare like it will be in Somalia, but maybe it will be high because the population has a healthy lifestyle, like in the United States. Or maybe it's high simply because the population is very aged, like in Monaco and other countries, many other countries. We don't know why. So after the initial crude death rate is calculated, we do not immediately jump to conclusions. In fact, we transform it to standardized mortality. And then we already can make some assumptions and compare countries. But we don't use the crude death rate by itself. We only use it to calculate the rate of natural increase. So provide the short-term forecast for changes in the population. This is the map of the world according to the crude death rate. So these countries in the dark brown, they have high rates of deaths annually. As expected, many African countries are here. But then you see that most of Eastern Europe is here as well. In fact, and see, second group, according to mortality. Again, African countries and all of these Central European and Northern European countries. How can this be possible? That's why we don't use crude death rates. If you take a look at the crude death rate, you'll find that the country with the highest mortality, general mortality in the world, the highest crude death rate is Bulgaria, followed by the Ukraine. Does this mean that it is more dangerous to live in these countries than in some African countries? Of course not. If you compare Turkey to Germany, you will find that death rates are higher in Germany than in Turkey. What does this mean? That Turkey is more economically advanced, that it has better healthcare, the Turkish citizens have healthier lifestyles? Of course not. None of this is true. It's because the population is way younger. So we have to standardize. This is just the stepping stone for further calculations. Standardized mortality. The ratio of the number of deaths from a specified condition over the number that would be expected if the study population, etc., blah, blah. So let me explain this simply. In order to have the standardized mortality, there are different possible ways of standardization, direct and indirect ways of standardization, like in epidemiology in general. But the most commonly used procedure here is to use the so-called standard population. This is a methodology of the WHO that is widespread, most commonly used. So you take a sample that is 100,000 strong from the populations of the two compared countries, and then you compare them. And this sample is standardized. So you have 50-50 males, females, because of course males always have higher mortality. And you have the same number of people in all age subgroups. So same number between 0 and 10, 10 to 20, etc., etc. So in fact, here you compare age-specific mortality rates. You don't compare what's the final mortality rate in Germany and Turkey, or in France and Tunisia, because then you'll find that the less developed countries have, in fact, lower mortality. No, you compare the mortality between 0 and 10 in Turkey, Tunisia, France, Germany, 10 to 20, etc., etc. Now, once you do this, things fall into their places. Just as expected, it turns out that the more developed countries have lower standardized mortality. So, in fact, they have lower mortality in all age subgroups, much lower. And the only reason the final mortality is higher in some of the more developed countries is that because their population is way more aged. So let's take a look at standardized mortality rates now for males and females. As you can see, the country with the lowest standardized mortality of males is Japan, followed by France and the Netherlands. So you won't see here countries like Turkey, Tunisia, etc., or any other Islamic country. Because if you take a look at the crude death rates, you get the impression that Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, etc., Oman have the lowest mortality. So then you say, okay, probably these are the richest countries globally with the best possible healthcare, and then their population leads extremely healthy lifestyles. Probably all Saudi Arabians are vegans, riding bicycles, etc., etc. Of course not. This would be an extremely stupid assumption to make. So you standardize, and now you don't see them among the leaders. By the way, you see Greece here. This is for males. And these are the top countries for females. And as you can see, even USA is, the United States is among the top countries in low standardized mortality, even they, with their unhealthy lifestyles. So, of course, the effects of socioeconomic development and healthcare quality are paramount. Now, in terms of females, France comes first. They have the lowest standardized mortality, followed by Japan and followed by Switzerland. So overall, apparently, the winner is Japan. This is the healthiest nation on our planet, and it is no wonder that they have the highest life expectancy. Now, the infant mortality rate and the maternal mortality rates, they are somewhat different from the general mortality, and there are no puzzles here. It is not possible to find here a less developed country that has a lower infant mortality. No, infant mortality and maternal mortality are directly dependent on the level of development of the country. To the extent that some economists use these indicators. After all, they're much better than using bogus fantasy indicators like the gross domestic product, which is supposed to measure the production of a country, but it measures nothing like this. It's just some meaningless number. Because it tries to measure economic activity in current price levels, and it fails even at that. But if you take a look at the infant mortality rate of countries globally, then you'll know immediately how developed the country is and how countries actually rate. So it's the number of deaths of babies before the age of 1 divided by the number of live births annually and multiplied by 1,000. Infant mortality rates and maternal mortality also are the lowest globally in the European Union, which of course immediately diagnoses the European Union as the most developed region on our planet. These are infant mortality rates. As you can see, this yellowish zone is the zone of very low infant mortality. So these are, in fact, the developed countries currently. This is the developed world. That's the way to find out what is actually the developed part of the world. If you see it in yellow here, then that's it. Everything after that is not good. And you can see the countries with the lowest mortality rates are Iceland, Singapore, Japan. The countries with the highest ones, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central African Republics, Lesotho, Somalia. These countries are complete failure. They should be ashamed of themselves and probably dissolved, because if a state is unable to serve its citizens and provide decent standard of living, then why does it even exist? Okay, but that's their problem. We don't care now. Let's continue. Maternal mortality. So these are basically that's related to complications of birth and pregnancy. It is most commonly measured up until the 42nd day after birth, though sometimes, especially the WHO measures it for an entire year after birth. But try to remember 42. It's calculated per 100,000 because it's a rare event in developed countries, so it's calculated per 100,000 births. The only thing that's not mentioned per thousand in demography is maternal mortality, remember this. But in fact, it's not so rare in underdeveloped countries. In the underdeveloped countries, the situation is quite the opposite. It's not just common, it is a leading cause of death. So for many African countries, and for some sub-periods of life, there it is the leading cause of death for women. This is the situation globally. So the more greenish a country is, the more developed it is. So it has less maternal mortality. The more it turns red, the less developed the country is, and it exhibits exorbitant maternal mortality. Again, Africa, almost the entirety of it is colored in red. And Afghanistan, as usual, it's a failed state after all. Okay. Causes of death. Globally, for example, in the year 2012, when there was such an annual report of the WHO, non-communicable diseases are already responsible for 68% of all deaths. So this is the prevailing pathology in humans nowadays, even in the developing and underdeveloped countries. So this is the future of medicine, chronic conditions. The four main non-communicable diseases, so these are the major diseases globally: ischemic heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and other conditions. Communicable maternal, neonatal, and nutritional conditions, so acute pathology, were responsible for 23% of global deaths. But remember that most of the global population lives in developing and underdeveloped countries, not in developed ones. So these statistics, in fact, reflects more on the situation in the less developed world. And finally, injuries of all types caused 9% of all deaths. Injuries means many things. It means traffic accidents, it means murders, suicides, etc., etc. It means occupational accidents. So It may say injuries, but in fact, the causes of death will be very different for different countries. If it says injuries for Japan, it would mean mostly suicides. If it says injuries for Egypt, for example, it would mean mostly car crashes. If it says injuries for Russia or the United States, it would mean murders, etc., etc. So that's dependent on the country. For India and most African countries, it's mostly occupational incidents. So at the workplace, dangerous jobs in mines, plants, etc., etc. Causes of death. In terms of proportion of deaths that are due to non-communicable diseases, high-income countries have the highest proportion. 87% of all deaths are caused by them. Upper middle-income countries, that's a classification of the World Bank that is similar to the classification used by the UN and WHO. So these are, in fact, high-income countries corresponds to highly developed countries. This corresponds to developed countries. This corresponds to developing countries, and this to underdeveloped countries. So only in underdeveloped countries, as you can see, chronic conditions are not the leading cause of death. Now, what's typical of developed countries? Cardiovascular diseases come first with approximately 50% of all deaths, maybe even higher in some countries. In Bulgaria, it's more than 60%. Cancer comes second with approximately 20%. Bulgaria is like that. In Bulgaria, it's something like 18 point something percent. And the third major cause of death are injuries. Bulgaria also has many traffic accidents, so it doesn't look okay here as well. Respiratory disease is approximately 6% of all deaths. Of course, injuries may increase. Pay attention to this, also as a result of the aging of the population. Remember that very old people, like you'll find in many European countries, will have tendency for sudden falls. And then things like, the complicated fracture of the femoral neck. It's so typical of old age, and it may be, in the end, the cause of death. Factors influencing mortality decline, measured, of course, as a standardized mortality in developed countries. Increasing family income and standards of living, improved nutrition, control of infectious diseases, safe water, disease prevention, clinical care services with improved access and quality, health promotion, social security systems, improved conditions of work and recreation. Of course, things that are well known to all of us in Europe. What are the demographic trends in general? We'll finish with this. There are, I think, 2 more slides left, and that's it. There are very substantial differences between regions of the world in population characteristics and trends. The size of the world's population is still growing, but most of this growth is happening in underdeveloped countries. Developing countries with high birth rates are experiencing population growth exceeding their economic growth capacity. The population of European countries is also growing, while the age structure of the population is becoming older, even with the influx of younger migrants. We are still getting older. A turning point occurred in the early 1990s when net migration became the main driver of population growth and has since far outpaced natural change of the population. So, in the end, The share of older persons in the total population will increase significantly in the coming decades as a greater proportion of the post-war baby boom generations reaches retirement. This will in turn lead to an increased burden on those of working age to provide for social expenditure required by the aging population. And we don't know if we are going to make it economically. In fact, no one knows for how long we'll be able to support our current social systems, social security systems. The demographic transition. The transformation of a population with high fertility, we'll conclude with this, with high fertility, relatively high mortality, young age structures, and rapid growth to a population with low vital rates, older age structure, and slow or no growth is called the demographic transition. The demographic transition is a long-term trend for declining birth and death rates, resulting in substantial changes to age distribution of a population. But in the long run, death rates will increase again, I warned you. Of this, the demographic transition model describes the changes that occur as a country or population moves through stages of development. It's characterized by the following stages: high and balanced birth and death rates. We saw this on the figure in the first presentation. Then high birth rates and low death rates. Then we see rapid growth in the population. Then we have low and balanced birth and death rates when the population is more or less stationary, and finally stable population with low birth and death rates and graying of the population. So let's finish with the traditional and unfortunately the new model of the demographic transition, which is considered to be in fact true nowadays. Now, this model is also called first or traditional demographic transition. That refers to the historical declines in mortality and fertility as witnessed from the 18th century onwards in Europe. The endpoint of the first demographic transition was supposed to be an older, stationary, and stable population, corresponding with replacement fertility, zero population growth, and life expectations over 70 years, life expectancies. As there would be an ultimate balance between deaths and births, there would be no demographic need for sustained immigration. So these were the optimists that believed that this would be the end stage of development of European populations, and we wouldn't need any migrants and refugees. But unfortunately, this model failed, and this is the new model. In 1986, the new concept of the second demographic transition was introduced, reflecting the changes in demographic trends in industrialized countries characterized by fertility decline. These changes in demographic behavior happened in many populations after the 1960s. Slovakia is here provided as an example. This is a stage characterized by full control over fertility. Couples appear to lack the motivation to have more than one, or at best 2 children. Fertility has declined below replacement levels. There may be an element of postponement of births, so they happen later in life, involved in the very low levels of fertility currently observed. And there are signs that that fertility will continue to stay at low level, way below what is required for the replacement of the population. This will result in a new demographic imbalance between births and deaths. The effects of this imbalance are visible already. It generates a compensatory trend in the third demographic factor of the classical demographic balancing equation, migration. Or as I told you, we need migration. Otherwise, we won't be able to sustain our economies. Well, most probably we will reach the point of economic collapse because of having too many pensioners, even before our nation becomes physically extinct. So that's it. Our hands are tied. Even if we don't like migrants, we have to adopt them. Life expectancy. Okay, sorry, forgot about this. Let's quickly remind you of life expectancy and then we're finished. The life expectancy, the average life expectancy is not the median age of people dying in a certain year, as some students appear to believe. No, it is in fact a prognostic indicator, it's a forecast. It's based on life tables for survival, those same tables used in any sort of insurance. So when we say that the life expectancy is 72 or 74 or 75 for the Bulgarian population in this year, it means that babies born in this year are going to live up to, let's say, 75 on average. Babies born in this year. So it is a prognosis for a certain generation. The prognosis is very different, by the way, for males and females. For example, for Bulgaria, the difference is approximately 8 years in favor of females. And then you can find countries like Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, where it can reach up to 15 years difference, which is amazing. Even Japan, with its very healthy population, has a 7 years difference between males and females. So this is to be considered normal. So always, of course, that's the second warning. Life expectancies should be provided separately for males and females, not provide one life expectancy for the whole country. And let's finish with these pretty maps. This is what life expectancy was in 1800. As you can see, Europe did not have the highest life expectancy at the time. It was close to the two Americas and Oceania. This is how drastically life expectancy, the average life expectancy, has changed in 1950. So immediately after the Second World War, the world leaders were Australia, Canada, and the United States, followed by Western European countries. And this is the current situation, more or less. The year is 2015, so before the COVID pandemic. Countries in the blue have reached an average life expectancy of over 80 already. So you can see here Australia, New Zealand, here's Greece, and many more European countries. Canada, the United States apparently already falling behind. Then you have the second group of countries. They have an average life expectancy of somewhere between 70 and 80. The green zone, where you find Bulgaria as well. And these here in the yellow zone are apparently Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Okay, and finally, you don't have countries already in the red zone. You don't have countries already in this orange zone. So the lowest life expectancy currently is somewhere between 50 and 60 years. You find it in African countries. So that was it. Any questions?
No, Professor, thank you.
Okay, I will upload the two presentations and we'll continue tomorrow at 9 o'clock with epidemiology.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
Okay, see you. Bye. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.
Bye, doctor.
Bye.